So what is it?
I'm the Doctor.
So what is it?
I'm the Doctor.
So what is it?
I'm the Doctor.
Only joking.
I'm the Doctor.
So what is it?
I'm the Doctor.
So what is it?
I'm the Doctor.
Only joking.
I'm the Doctor.
So what is it?
Small off-duty Czechoslovakian traffic warden.
So what is it?
I'm the Doctor.
Only joking.
I'm the Doctor.
So what is it?
I'm the Doctor.
Alright dudes, it's time for another episode of It's Time to Rewind. I'm known as Bubbawheat, not the Bubbawheat, not first name Bubba, last name Wheat, just Bubbawheat. This season is Red Who, where I'm covering British sci-fi like Red Dwarf and Doctor Who, and joining me 3 million years in the future via the TARDIS is my guest JR Southall from Strangers in Space. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I am good. It's good to have you on. I don't know why, but this... I've mentioned it once or twice before, but this season has been very interesting in terms of trying to book guests. I've had a lot of guests just kind of ghost me, but I'm glad that I got a hold of you, and this today we're talking about the wedding of Sarah Jane Smith, which is the third serial from the third season of the Sarah Jane Adventures, and it originally aired on October 29th and 30th in 2009.
Are you have you seen many of the Sarah Jane Adventures, or is this your first one?
It's funny because whenever I talked a little bit about this, I just recently kind of came into Doctor Who fandom with the Groundhog Day episode, the Eve of the Daleks, and then I kind of jumped back to the beginning of New Who, and then once I started doing this season, I started jumping back into watching New Who. I was right around or the second season of David Tennant. And I also started jumping into Sarah Jane Adventures as well, because I'm a very slow binger, and and so I started recording this like in late summer, early fall of last year, and as of right now, that we are in early April, and I've finished the first 4 seasons of Sarah Jane Adventures, and I still have the last 6 episodes to go.
Oh, wow. You've done pretty well then. Because this is sort of a sequel to The Temptation of Sarah Jane Smith from the second series, I think. But you don't obviously need to have seen that to follow this, but you clearly have then, haven't you?
Yeah, I think it's, I figured it was nice to, and not just kind of jump in, because this is like one of the 2 crossover episodes that they had, or serials. It's kind of funny that classic Doctor Who was all serials, and then New Who was mostly one-off episodes with occasional 2-parters, and then Sarah Jane Adventures came in, and it's all all the episodes are 2-part episodes.
Best to say, the word we use is stories.
Yeah, that's... I feel like I keep trying to figure out what to call it, and surprisingly, I've had a lot of British guests, and I think maybe one or two people have mentioned stories, but yeah, I seem to skip over just calling them stories, which I do really like. But before we get too far into Sarah Jane Adventures, I would like to hear a little bit about your overall history with Doctor Who and the Sarah Jane Adventures as well.
Well, I started in about 1973, and I basically haven't missed an episode since. I used to write about Doctor Who for a magazine back about 15 years ago till about 10 years ago. And that's how I got into podcasting too, because I was writing for the magazine. I was also doing film reviews and stuff, but I did a Doctor Who column, and I did the Doctor Who story reviews when there were stories on the TV. And the editor of the magazine had a radio show which he used to put out on the magazine's website afterwards as a podcast. And one day he just emailed me out of the blue and said, I want to add a Doctor Who podcast to the website too. He said, will you be in charge of it and send me the episodes? Tell me how often you want to do it, and away you go. And at the time, this was 13 years ago, I didn't have an MP3 player. Mobile phones weren't anything like as sophisticated as they are now, so I'd never heard a podcast. So I thought, well, I don't want to do it, but if I say no, somebody else will do it, and I'll regret that. So from about 13 years ago to now, I've been podcasting as well about Doctor Who, plus film reviews and stuff. So that's kind of my history with the programme. I've watched it ever since I was about 4, and I have had a rather more serious interest in it for about the last 13 years since I've been writing and podcasting and stuff about it too.
Nice. So you've been podcasting, almost exactly as long as I have, because I started as well back in 2012. Although I had been listening to podcasts at that time. I started with Kevin Smith. He did his
Right,
Smodcast,
yes, of course.
very early on, and I kind of stumbled onto that, and became a big fan of his podcasts. And then I started a movie blog.
Right.
And then joined a movie blogging community, which also had a movie podcasting community, and they had like kind of an open call guest podcast, which is still going on, the Lambcast. And they, I joined on for an episode of that for the Dark Knight Rises.
Right.
And then I kind of caught the bug, and I've gone through various different podcasts, and I'm still doing probably more podcasts than I should. But
you just
fun.
get addicted to it. It's like, over here in the UK, in America, it's slightly different. You have slightly different habits, I guess. But here in the UK, one thing that we tend to do, I suppose, is go to the pubs, see your friends at the weekends, sit down and just chat. And podcasting has become the equivalent of going to the pub and having those conversations, but instead you stay at home and do it on the cheap.
Yeah, which is perfect for me, because I'm not a drinker, and I'm not a big social person.
You go.
I'm very happy to talk one-on-one with somebody. So like podcasting is perfect social interactions for me.
Yeah.
So.
It's been through so much change over the last 10 years as well, hasn't it?
Yeah.
When you started as well, I bet most of what was going on was independent. The Kevin Smith one, for instance, he didn't set that up with a film studio. He just set it up himself, didn't he? And this was the thing that he was doing. And so when we started, we had 10 times as many listeners as we do now, because now all the big companies said, and the newspapers, magazines, anywhere that publishes anything, they've got a podcast, and there's only so many hours that people have to listen to these things. So a lot of the independent ones are just getting squeezed smaller and smaller and smaller.
Yeah, there used to be hundreds of podcasts, then there were thousands of podcasts. Now there's like practically millions of podcasts.
Yeah, there are certainly well into the tens of thousands, probably, very likely, hundreds and hundreds of thousands for sure.
Yeah, it is, and it especially, it kind of exploded again during the pandemic.
Absolutely, yeah.
They didn't have anything to do, so they, tons of people started podcasts in 2020.
Yeah, spend the morning watching telly, spend the afternoon podcasting about it.
And then, whenever, do you remember when Sarah Jane Adventures came out? Like, did you jump into that one as well?
Oh yeah, sure. I have a feeling there might be a couple of episodes that I never did get around to seeing, because it was on a sort of like slightly odd time of the day, and it was one of those things where you caught up with it when you could, and so sometimes I'd go a couple of weeks and then I'd have to catch up. So I have a feeling there's probably a couple of episodes in the last series I might not have seen at all, but basically most of them I watched when they came out. Even though, to be fair, a lot of them I've only ever watched them once.
Yeah,
because it is TV aimed at children, basically. Right?
Yeah, that's something that I definitely noticed, especially in the first couple seasons. I really felt the kiddie nature, right? I do feel like it kind of, well, I mean, like with a lot of children's programming, or especially like teenage programming, it tends to age with the kid actors.
Right, absolutely.
And I do think that season 4, I think, had a lot of good episodes and a little, more slightly grown up episodes. Because I mean that's what I've just kind of finished watching. I finished watching the final, the Goodbye Sarah Jane Smith episode,
Right, yeah.
last night.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
and I think that was a pretty good one, as well as the one where Clyde and Ronnie were the only two people left on Earth.
That's a great story, actually.
Yeah.
The next, you've got 3 more to go, because sadly they only filmed half of the 5th series. So they kind of did the... So, I mean, the way Russell T Davies was running Doctor Who is you'd stack all the frivolous stories up at the start of the series and get into the more serious ones at the other end of the series at the back end. And of course, if you only film half the series, that kind of tends to mean that you generally end up with the more frivolous episodes. But the second story of the final 3 is a pretty good one, maybe the best one they ever did. So that's something to look forward to. Sadly, the very last story is sort of like, it's okay, but it's not the place where the series would have gone out if they'd have had the choice.
I did read that that Russell T Davies, he plans to have Luke as a character come out as gay afterwards.
Yeah, all sorts of things would probably have happened if they'd have known what was going to happen and they'd have had time to plan around it. I'm sure there's lots of things that they would have made sure they got around to that were probably in the back of their minds, because when you do a series like this, you tend to have longer term plans as well as shorter term ones, don't you? Things you think, oh, I'll get around to that one day in a couple of years or whatever. And then before you know it, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah. And, I thought it was interesting that, they introduced Luke in the pilot episode, and then Luke goes away at kind of the beginning of the 4th season. And Clyde doesn't show up until the 2nd episode, but he's in, he stays through the end.
Yeah.
And then you also have Maria that was in the 1st season, and then she gets replaced by Ronnie, which is, it's one of those where they replace the character with almost the exact same character.
Well, probably because the writers have basically been told, right, you're writing for this character. And then the actor is like, because they're all school kids.
Mm-hmm.
So the actors are going off to do their exams or something, and they're like, well, I can't do the next series because I'll be doing my exams. And they're like, okay, let's throw somebody else in, and we've already got the scripts already written anyway, so we'll just swap out the names.
Yeah, although I did like Gita as a character more than Maria's mom.
Right, fair enough. Yeah, Gita's funny. There are a lot of the parent characters are quite funny, actually, aren't they?
Yeah, even though Clyde's mom only shows up in 2 episodes and she barely has anything to do, Clyde just mostly exists as a separate entity.
Yeah. Mind you, I do love him. I do think by this point of the Sarah Jane Adventures, I think they pretty much got the cast sort of perfectly balanced, really. Angela Mahindra, obviously, who plays Rani, she's gone on to great things. She's wonderful. But yeah, Daniel Anthony, who plays Clyde Langer, I think he's wonderful too, actually. I think he's a great lead because he kind of becomes the sort of lead of the series at this point, doesn't he? You sort of see things through his eyes, and it's like...
Yeah, he's the one that introduces the opening credits at this point.
Yeah. He even looks at the camera as you go into the title. And it's almost as if, right, so now you follow me back out the other end and I'm telling the story sort of thing. Obviously, he's not telling the story, but you basically see it through his eyes. All the other characters, even the ones that obviously you already know, but you're seeing them afresh through his eyes. I think it really works well, actually. This series and the sort of few that follow really work well, I think, with him at the centre of it.
Yeah, I do like him as a character, and Ronnie as well, and her family. I think that they got the balance better with Ronnie's family than they did with Maria's family, with the divorced parents, but the mom is still always around.
Yeah. They get they have some nice ideas for the relationships, and they do that thing that some children's telly does quite well. Peanuts does. It comes out of Peanuts, really, where the children all relate to each other sort of relatively normally on a particular kind of a level, and then the grown-ups are a level set apart, and you see the grown-ups only the way the children do. So obviously in Peanuts you get the wah, wah, wah thing. Here you don't get that, but what you do instead is the grown-ups are kind of slightly caricatured. The way the children sort of perceive them rather than the way they really actually would be.
Yeah, and especially, I think another great moment is during the one where Gita sees the aliens, the one with the Jadoon and the
Right.
chameleon. I forget his name. The first one with him, the second one with him. And she is going to the alien support groups, and and then at the end, it was the Men in Black. The first episode of season 4.
Right.
And then at the end, they let her in on everything, and then she goes off on, a wild tangent, and then they have the Men in Black to, basically neuralize her and make her forget about everything. And so it goes, it's the sitcom, it's reset everything back to normal at the end of the episode.
Yeah, sure. I really need to go back and take another look at some of these. I've not watched them for ages, a lot of these stories.
Yeah, like I said, I think it does, it struggles a bit in the beginning because I think it is too kid centric, but I actually really am enjoying it because I started it and it was kind of a slog. I was watching it because okay, I got to get to the wedding of Sarah Jane Smith because that's the episode that I'm covering, and I'm a bit of a completionist, so it's I want to watch everything leading up to that so that I'm well informed for this episode. And then by the time I got there, then the quality had improved enough to where I wanted to continue and not just drop out. And now into season 4, I'm actually quite enjoying it, and a little disappointed that I've only got 3 episodes left, and due to the death of
sure,
Elizabeth Sladen. Yeah.
Have you tried Torchwood yet?
Yeah, I started Torchwood, but I only got a couple episodes in. Not because I didn't like it, but I do have a toddler running around in the house, and I know that Torchwood is kind of, it's not R-rated, but it's a little bit more grown up. So I tend to, whenever I have the chance at something to watch and she's running around, if I'm going to watch, am I going to watch Sarah Jane or Torchwood? Oh, she's running around. I think I'll watch Sarah Jane or K9.
I think, to be honest, this is much better than Torchwood anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I do have, one of my, podcast friends, Lackey, he's been on several episodes this season. He is not a fan of Torchwood at all.
Yeah, I kind of like the idea of it, but I think I think some of the choices they made in the production of it just kind of, well, put it this way, it wasn't to my taste. So when it was first on, I watched it religiously because obviously Doctor Who spin-off for grown-ups and being a grown-up, but the more it went on, I think the less I liked it, and the more the years have gone on, I don't think the years have been kind to it either.
Yeah, I think his problem, and a lot of people can have this problem with certain shows, is that it's a show with a lot of irredeemable characters. A lot of characters that have very significant flaws, and some shows can handle that well, and some shows don't. And depending on your personality, it's I think Torchwood sounds like it's one that struggles a bit.
Yeah, it's like it sets these unlikable characters up, but never really finds a way to make them likable, I don't think. Which you have to do, don't you? Because even if you're telling, I guess, I've not seen Breaking Bad, but I'm assuming that Breaking Bad is kind of basically about unlikable characters that you like and that you want to find out more about. Torchwood, I think, is about unlikable characters that you don't like and you don't really care about and you don't want to know anything more about.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. But let's go ahead and actually jump into the episode that we are talking about. The wedding of Sarah Jane Smith, and you mentioned about the filming schedule, and I did read on the wiki article that David Tennant actually did film this after he had finished his filming for his run on Doctor Who.
Yeah, because there's that weird line from Sarah at the end that comes absolutely out of nowhere, and that is entirely metatextually for the audience at home. Is this the last time I'm ever going to see you, she says, when there's been no indication whatsoever in the story itself that would be the last time she ever sees him, but that's entirely because everybody working on the programme knows that, yes, this is the last time you'll see him, because this is the last thing he's making. It's like, I'm not really sure why that line survived to the final edit, because it doesn't really make any sense, and it just...
Although I assume that, I didn't check the dates, but I imagine that, after reading that, I kind of assumed that this episode aired before
yes,
Tennant's final episode. So, based on that timeline, she is going to see him one more time, and as he goes around and says goodbye to everybody, and then we find out later, and with Matt Smith, that he said goodbye to everybody.
Yeah, for sure. So yes, it's like this funny sort of throw forward to the end, and it's kind of there for the audience to say, remember, David's leaving in a few weeks. But it's like, yeah, okay, we already know David's leaving in a few weeks. It just strikes a really weird, odd note at the end of the episode, I think.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, and then in this episode, I think a lot of Sarah Jane Adventure episodes have this moment where Sarah Jane, as a character, is acting unlike herself. Which causes the kids to have to investigate, and this is no different. She's going around being secretive, hiding things. Like, do you feel like this is like very out of character for you? Like, do you think that the ring that they show that is kind of influencing her? Like, do you think that's influencing her quite a bit in order to keep this relationship a secret, or do you think that she maybe would have done that anyways?
Well, I think she's doing that anyway, because the ring only turns up halfway through the story or halfway through the first episode, doesn't it? And she becomes influenced by the ring after. Prior to that, I think it's him, isn't it, rather than the ring. So before that, it's a sort of human relationship, despite the fact that, spoilers, he's not quite what he seems, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But the way she comes into the series right back at the start in the very first episode is she doesn't really have anything to do with anybody. She's very much of a sort of loner, lives by herself, doesn't socialise, does her investigations, but beyond that, doesn't really have anything to do with the neighbours or anything. And I think this kind of feels like it harkens back to that in a slightly knowing way, but at a point after that's no longer true. So the whole thing, the way the story's introduced feels like it's slightly out of step with where the series has gone anyway, doesn't it? Because you've watched it all in quite close sort of succession. So you've seen that progression of her character, haven't you? From being the
and
real
this feels
loner,
like very much like a regression in her character after 2.5 seasons. And you
can sort of see that that's an okay thing to do in dramatic terms. But sometimes, especially with some of the writers, I think, in Doctor Who, and particularly of this period, because the thing about Doctor Who and its spin-offs at this time, right, is Russell T Davies is far more interested in character development than he is in whether the stories sort of logically make any sense. And so sometimes I think they will make the characters do odd things that are out of character in order to facilitate something they want to do with the story that can sort of develop a different character beat. And so I think I just put it down to, at the start of this one, well, they're making Sarah Jane do that because otherwise they can't get this story to make any sense. Because otherwise, what's your first 20 minutes of the story going to be? It's not going to work, is it?
Yeah.
You need to have that point of revelation where the kids find out, oh, it's not an alien, it's a guy she's going to get married to. You need to have that surprise. And if you don't get Sarah Jane doing weird stuff at the start of the episode, you can't get to that surprise moment.
Yeah, and this has like a few surprise moments because they follow her and they discover that, oh, she's on a date, and then there's that reveal, and then there's the second reveal where they go to his house and realize that it's all bagged up and not really lived in, and then that's whenever the ring's been introduced, and so that's whenever she starts getting influenced, away from him, because I do think that you're right. So which I did watch the episode like last week, so some details might have slipped a little bit. I do agree that if the ring, I guess because that was the engagement ring that he gives her, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah.
So before that, I think it was just, him doing the subtle manipulation, probably encouraging her to keep the relationship a secret. And, because she's probably told him all about, her family, I guess, her found family.
None of that's ever really made quite clear. And the thing about... And so it could be that the writer was just... The thing that was in the writer's head is, oh, she wants to keep it a secret until the moment she's sure, and then she can tell the kids. But I don't think that really manifests on screen particularly strongly. So, so this story in particular, but the Sarah Jane adventures in general, they come up with a sort of high concept idea for each episode. What if ghosts were real, sort of thing, or what if the Slitheen are taking over a food factory or something, whatever. Some kind of high concept or whatever for the start of each episode. And then a bunch of other ideas will come out of that. The one where the kids are stranded on a deserted Earth, for instance, that's brilliant. Here, you've got some really interesting stuff that kind of goes slightly into the kind of... Frankenheimer territory of kind of conspiracy theory stuff. The bit where the kids go to the deserted house, that, if it had a bit of time to develop that and to make it spooky, that could have been a really brilliant part of the episode. But actually, it's all over and done with in about 90 seconds or something, and it becomes fairly insubstantial, and it's more about the idea rather than the way the idea is put on screen. So
and then it adds the the suspicious element, because there's always this suspicious element. At first it's like Sarah Jane is off doing things and not telling them, and then after this comes in, they tell her about his flats that being not lived in. And then we see the suspiciousness of the ring glowing, and then she explains it away. Oh, that's his second home. He lives somewhere closer to work, and he doesn't really live there. And so that kind of clues the audience into that something else is going on in the episode.
Yeah, because she's clearly making that bit up. And so it's clearly not the case, but she wants to put the kids off the scent because she's fallen in love and she doesn't want them to be suspicious of the guy. And if there is something wrong, she doesn't want to face it at that point, does she?
And then Peter Dalton as a character, I think he does get a few good moments. And I think one of my favorite moments is whenever Peter, and Luke are having dinner. And she goes away to use the restroom. And Luke and Peter have a nice moments where they talk about how she's so investigative, and of course the kids are going to be the same way. And then she comes back and she says, "Oh, what were you talking about?" And they're like, "Oh, nothing." And she's like, "Oh, come on," because her investigative nature is she has to know. And I think that's that was a very great parallel between her and the kids, and showing the audience that she is so much like them. And of course, if she were put in the same position, she would have done exactly the same thing.
It shows how well the writers know the characters. which makes that whole sort of first 10 minutes of the episode or whatever it was just that little bit more kind of slightly uncomfortable, where they're running around doing things that feel out of character. But you know, it's television, it's telling a story. Sometimes you just have to take things on the chin and say, yeah, the story wouldn't work if you didn't do these things. So sometimes you've just got to do the things, I think.
Yeah, and then throughout the first episode, we also have the moments where we start hearing this TARDIS sound. So they kind of tease that it's going to be a a Doctor Who crossover, and this is, I believe it's the first one. You know, I did kind of watch some of the episodes out of order, so like between Sarah Jane and Doctor Who. So I think I had seen, or maybe I had not yet seen the episode where. I think I was still in David Tennant, so I hadn't seen, his ending where, Sarah Jane and Luke show up on his show.
Yeah.
Which I believe had happened before. So whenever he came in and said, "Oh, Luke, it's so good to see you again," in my head, I was like, had they seen each other?
Yes, because Sarah Jane and Luke are in the final episode or the final story of David Tennant's regular series before he did the specials. And then this was broadcast during the year when they had the specials just before the final two-parter.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, is that time. This is that part in Doctor Who history when the sort of regular run that we'd been having for the last 4 years was kind of coming to pieces a bit. And so Sarah Jane Adventures here, I think they threw David Tennant in fairly late in the day because he was doing Hamlet on stage and he had enough time to do 3 Doctor Who stories, I think. And then so I'm not sure the exact truth of this, but as I understand it, it turned out that he had more time than they thought he had. And so because the Doctor Who ones were already locked in, they threw in a Sarah Jane adventure kind of as an extra Doctor Who story for him to have during the course of the year, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
So this was something that was added later after the other specials had already been sorted out, as I understand it.
Yeah, I could see that. And I mean, he really only shows up in the second part, and his role is like relatively limited. So I'd imagine that he probably didn't have to do, and it's practically all in just 2 locations because it's just the wedding chapel, and then the final scene in the attic.
And that stuff about the TARDIS sound as well. I mean, there's 2 things about that. One is clearly the audience at home knows that David Tennant's going to be in it. So every time they hear the TARDIS sound, they're thinking, "Oh, he's coming." Oh, no, he's not. And so you get about 3 or 4 of those before he finally turns up. But then the other thing is, those noises are happening. Sometimes the characters notice them. Sometimes the characters don't notice them. At least 2 of the characters, Sarah Jane Smith and Luke, ought to recognise what the sound means, but either don't seem to notice that it's happening at all, or don't recognise it, or what. So that was kind of slightly confusing as well, wasn't it? It's, again, another thing about this story that works for the audience that doesn't really make entire sense when you see it on the screen in front of you. Yeah. And I think sometimes with these stories as well, if you watched it when it went out and David Tennant was just about to leave, then it makes a different kind of sense than if you watch it now, sort of like nearly 15 years later, when you're watching it. Because now we're watching this as a story. Then, I guess we were watching it as, a tiny little bit more of David Tennant that was extra on top of what we thought we were going to get before he leaves in a few weeks' time. So it makes a different kind of sense then than it did now.
Mm-hmm. And then we do get to the wedding, which it's nice, and they have the line about the brigadier not being able to come, which again in the behind the scenes trivia, I read that they had planned to bring him in, but he was recovering from a stroke during this time.
Yeah, it would have been his final appearance in the Doctor Who universe, sadly, because I think he'd also been. The idea was that he was going to be in an episode of Doctor Who as well, like a year, maybe 2 years earlier, and couldn't do that either because obviously he was getting towards the end of his life and various illnesses were taking over. So it's a bit sad. It's nice that they threw the line in. I tell you what they did do, which kind of ameliorates that somewhat. The registrar at the wedding, Xenia Merton, she, the actress, had been basically a child actor in the very first series of Doctor Who back in 1964. So she played like a 15... I suspect she was probably 17, 18 at the time, but she played a 15-year-old in the story called Marco Polo that's sadly missing, but from way back in the sort of spring of 1964.
Yeah, interesting. And then I do think that the Trickster is one of the best one of the best villains in the Sarah Jane Adventures. I think he's much better than the Slitheen, who shows up way too many times, and the blathering, which is the recolored Slitheen, and also like something that I noticed that they went back to, I think really just twice, but twice is kind of too many. It's that, if I had a nickel every time they did that, I'd have 2 nickels, but it's weird that it happened twice. So with the alien race that's, everybody says is friendly, but they just happen to be the one unfriendly group, like the Blatherine, which are the one evil family connected to the Slitheen. And then the Vultures, who are, they're the good alien race that's, the Death Keepers. But then this happens to be the one evil group of this good race. Yeah.
But then you wouldn't get stories if you didn't do that. So I don't mind the Slitheen, actually. I quite like them. They're fun. They appeal to my sort of more comic end of my sort of Doctor Who tastes. I quite like Doctor Who when it's been a bit kind of slightly mad.
Yeah, I can see that. I think I just have to be in the right mood for it, and I think half the time I was not in the right mood. So it's like, I mean, I'm glad that they kind of got past the fart jokes whenever they were first introduced. But then even so, like with the blathering, it was still like, it felt very juvenile humor surrounding them and their characters.
Whereas the Trickster actually feels like a very grown-up villain to have in a program like this, doesn't it?
Yeah, and just the his entire concept of somebody that's this character, this angel of death almost, that shows up at your final instance and gives you a choice, and either enter into a deal with him or die, and then the entire episode, and that changes the entire future, the entire present based on your decision. And whenever the character has to rescind that decision, that means that they have died. And the first one was with Sarah Jane's childhood best friend, and she eventually gives up her life in order to save the entire world. And this happens again with Peter.
Yeah. And it sort of follows on from that earlier story, doesn't it? The Temptation of Sarah Jane Smith. Because these two stories are kind of about what happens when somebody's place in the universe, or somebody is missing from their place in the universe. So it's about, I guess, if you want to take the sort of, more philosophical approach to the idea, it's about everybody has a place in the universe and we all have a role and things that we need to do. And if you upset the balance of that, if you remove somebody from their role, then how does that affect the universe around them? In The Temptation of Sarah Jane Smith, it's very much about how it affects the universe around Sarah Jane Smith. Because they've done that story already, here they can make that the threat without needing to sort of show it again. So the threat here is more about the sort of personal thing between the guy that she wants to marry and the fact that he's being used as the tool of the villain. So it becomes more about the tool of the villain than it does about what the villain necessarily wants to achieve by this, because we've already seen what the villain wants to achieve by this in this sort of first appearance.
Yeah, in the first one, it was, a choice of one life for another. In this one,
Yeah.
it's more like the choice of like, happiness and stability and love versus adventure and I guess the rest of the world.
Yeah. And if you think about it, and this is a children's television program, right? And so there's kind of the thing about children's TV programs is there generally tends to be a sort of moral lesson of the week sort of thing, or just something from the children's lives that they might understand and recognize from what they're watching on the telly. And I think here, maybe what they're trying to illustrate here is like, so your parents aren't always around because they have to go out to work. So they become these figures of love and attention in the home. But during the working day, they become these people who have a different purpose and who have to go off and achieve different things, and that's their job. And so I think overall, the sort of big metaphor of this episode is Sarah Jane. Is she the mother to Luke, or is she the person who has a job to do and does her job? And I think that's kind of the big metaphor of the episode, so that kids watching it might not necessarily realize it's talking about their relationship with their parents, but I think deep down at a subconscious level, they might pick up on, oh, so when my dad or when my mum or whoever goes out to work and they're not around to give me their attention anymore, that's because they're doing important things elsewhere, and this is the way the universe works. At least that's what I'm kind of taking from it.
Yeah, and I did also want to take a moment to talk about the time loop of the episode, since this is a time loop podcast.
Well, that's what we're here for. There's not much of a one, is there?
Yeah, that is true. I mean, Sarah Jane didn't really have any true time loop episodes, but this does kind of have the concept of a time loop, anyways. Because I mean, none of the characters are really repeating anything because they're all kind of outside of the time loop. They're just it's used and I'm not too familiar with classic Who, but from what I understand, this is kind of a the way that they use time loops a lot in some of the classic Who stories, where the time loop is more of a prison. It's a way to trap somebody in time, and that's how this is. That they split off Sarah Jane and Peter, and then the three kids and the doctor. They're trapped in two different seconds of time, where the second of time is repeating over and over. But because it's just 1 second, there are no other people. It's just the wedding chapel, and we see the clock hand going back and forth between 1 second, and we see a horse race on TV, which I I don't quite understand why somebody would be watching a horse race on TV in the wedding chapel. I guess that's like the receptionist that's at the front that doesn't care about the wedding.
Maybe, but it could be that somebody in the wedding's got a bet on a race and they want the telly on in the background so they can find out whether they've won. I was just going to say, it is a thing in this country that weddings will stop for football matches and then carry on afterwards, and everybody just gathers around the football match on the telly, watches the football, and then basically carries on with the wedding after.
I did appreciate the attention to detail. At least I'm pretty sure that whenever we're shown the 1 second of the horse race in the kids' TV versus Sarah Jane's TV, it does look like it's 1 second later.
Yeah, they did. Yeah, they did know what they were doing there. You do have to wonder, though. I mean, this is a fair, the idea of a time loop. I suppose it's quite complicated from a logistical point of view, but it's a fairly simple idea. The idea of just a second repeating, and yet every time it turns up, right here and in Doctor Who and places like this, you've got a time loop. And then you've got people just carrying on as normal somewhere else. And it's like, you can't have your cake and eat it. Is there a time loop? Or is there not a time loop? Because if there is a time loop, these people really should be in the time loop too. And they should be using the time loop to escape from the time loop, even of the Daleks. But here, it's a case of, well, the time loop is... I don't think the writer really thinks the time loop is a thing in and of itself. It becomes a side issue to get rid of everybody else on the planet, in the universe, so he can divide these people off so that they can just have this adventure where they're isolated in this particular place outside of time until they resolve things and put things right. But it's not really a time loop story at all, is it?
No, it's not. It's just an adventure, and like you said, just an excuse for them to have an adventure full of people who know them but don't know the alien aspect of their lives, and so they have to do this alien adventure around all these people. So it makes sense from a story perspective to separate them from the people not in the know, so they can do what they need to do and then get back, and things are as normal, and also you have K9 underneath the table as well.
Have you seen Father's Day, the the Christopher Eccleston episode?
Yeah, that's the one that I covered for this season for his doctor.
Oh yes, and this is very much that, basically relocated with a slightly different high concept, but essentially it's basically the same thing, isn't it? Even down to the church. So it's all about what happens when time goes out of whack and you get a bunch of people in a singular location. There's some kind of outside influence. Some of the people in that location know what's going on. Some of the people don't, and somebody's getting married. So it's, it basically boils down to most of the same things, really. It doesn't feel particularly like it's repeating that story.
And it even has an element where, that the TARDIS goes away.
Yeah, totally. It repeats everything from that story. And yet I don't think you notice until it's pointed out that that's basically what it's doing.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't notice, and I watched this serial twice. I watched it as I was going through the series, and then I watched it again last week.
Yeah. It's great. There are lots of problems with it, but I think overall it's a pretty great piece of telly, really.
Yeah, and I also think that the solution with Clyde, hitting the TARDIS and being charged with the Artron energy, I think that was an interesting. And then he uses that to, it is a little bit of my Artron energy defeats your trickster time energy.
Yeah. It's kind of slightly Deus Ex Machina, but at the same time, it recognizes that if you're going to have time, in inverted commas, as the place where this episode is taking place, or the high concept around which this episode resolves, then you need to use time as your solution as well. And you can't, it doesn't have the time or the space, and it is for kids, so I don't think it has the wherewithal.
I do also like that they brought it back. For the other, whenever Matt Smith comes in, he's connected to Clyde specifically because he still has that residual Artron energy charge.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So I think it basically kind of works. The solutions to these stories are almost never really quite as thoroughgoing as they could be, or as clever as you think that they probably ought to be or might be, but they're okay. It's not about the solution. It's about how you get there.
Yeah, and of course the solution, just like in The Temptation, is Peter, rescinding his deal and making everything go back to normal. And I do think that
just like Rose's dad in Father's Day, by the way.
Yeah, that as well, and I do think that Elizabeth Sladen, her performance afterwards, after everything's back to normal, I think she really hits that really great. As she's just like, it says, the wedding's canceled, and then she kind of slowly walks out of the church, and it just leaves everybody wondering why the groom just disappeared out of nowhere, and then she's at back in the attic, just in like sweats and a very comfy but very like kind of stereotypically depressed woman clothes.
she's one of those actors where I think she has some awful moments sometimes, including in this episode. And I sometimes wonder if that's the choices that the editors and the director are making. And then she also has some brilliant moments. So you're right. The last sort of 2 or 3 minutes of this episode, she's fantastic. I think there are a few moments earlier where some of the overreactions to things that are going on are almost comic in their sort of weird banality. But she's the center of the episode, and I think it's important that she gets those moments at the end and that she sells them, and she does. Like I say, with kids' TV, often at the end of even in a lot of grown-up TV, but particularly in kids' TV, you need to have a sort of come-down part at the end where it can sink in what the story's really been about and what effect it's had, what the kind of knock-on is for the characters, because you can't, in kids' TV, you can't walk away at the end of the episode and not be, in terms of the characters, not be affected by what's happening, because otherwise no lesson is going to get learned, is it? And the important thing in kids' TV is that even if you do it lightly, there's got to be a kind of lesson there for the kids, because kids' TV kind of has to be slightly educational in a way. Mm-hmm. And so I think that those moments with Sarah Jane at the end of the episode are really important, and they're really well done.
Yeah. I think that the episode is kind of, especially I think that the second episode, the second part is much better than the first part, because the first part is struggling with a lot of the setup and a lot of characters not acting the way that they need to be acting. But I think that once we do get into the wedding chapel and the time loop, and all the action adventure stuff and the follow through with that, I think that the second part is much better than the first part.
Although I do think it's the kids who are the strongest part of this by a long way. Those 3 main characters, the 3 kids, I think they're all terrific. And I think they act the grown-ups off the screen, frankly, through most of it. But, it is what it is as well. I mean, they are the main characters, aren't they? Mm-hmm. Basically. Yeah. Even though you've got the Doctor coming in, you're still seeing the Doctor from the kids' perspective for a lot of it. I think it forgets that a couple of times, but I think mostly that's what's happening.
Yeah, and it's really like the kids with an assist from K9 that are the solution to the episode, and the Doctor just facilitates it.
Yeah. Yeah, you think the Doctor's coming in and he's going to solve it for them. And you think, oh no, he shouldn't really be doing that. It's their program, not his. And then at the end, that's not what happens at all, is it? It's almost like he comes in just to do. It's like David Tennant gets to come in, do an extra sort of 20 minutes of Sarah Jane Adventures as a sort of goodbye present to the Doctor Who fans. But in the end, the program does remember that it's about the kids. And in the end, he is just a guest in it rather than the central character after all. But he does feel like he's going to be the central character for 10 minutes.
Yeah. But I think that wraps up this episode. Do you have anything else to say about this story or about Sarah Jane Adventures as a whole?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think we've pretty much covered it, really, haven't we? It's not as substantial as a lot of Doctor Who can be, because I think being children's telly, and it sounds like I'm being patronising about children's telly, but I'm not. It just functions in a slightly different way, doesn't it? I think it has to concentrate more on the things it does. But also, I think you can have fun with it as well. And actually, one of the great things about this story is, and Sarah Jane Adventures altogether, is how much fun it is. Doctor Who sometimes can be really serious. And at the same time, Doctor Who kind of tends to address things in a slightly more grown-up way. But I think Sarah Jane Adventures hits a nice sort of groove where it's got its eye on things that it wants to talk about, but it does it in a really fun way that is entertaining for the adults as well as the kids. And I think it gets messages across really lightly. And so I think overall, Sarah Jane Adventures can feel a little bit light, but in the end, I think they pretty much justify their existence, basically. It's a really good program for kids, really.
Yeah, it definitely has some great episodes. You know, it has some not so great episodes as well, but you know, so does Doctor
Yeah,
Who.
yeah. I've got
But
to say, overall, it's not my favourite sort of period of Doctor Who plus spin-offs, the sort of Russell T Davies era. I really enjoyed it when it was happening. I don't think it's aged terrifically well either, because I think the stuff that came afterwards was much better. The Stephen Moffat stuff, and even some of the Chris Chibnall stuff, I think has been much better telly and much more complex and textured telly. But the Russell T Davies stuff is a lot of fun.
yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining me. And why don't you take a moment and let people know, you know, about your podcast and where you can be found
Yeah.
online.
Well, I mean, obviously you can Google JR Southall or Strangers in Space. We're called Strangers in Space because we put out 3 episodes a week, of which, generally speaking, one will be about Doctor Who, and the others are just about other things we're interested in. A lot of film reviews, occasionally a little bit of politics, books, other TV programs, sometimes music. Essentially, Love and Monsters, the Doctor Who story, which is about a bunch of people who are fans of the character of the Doctor, who come together and find that actually they're interested in lots of other things too. We're the podcasting equivalent of that. We podcast about a third of the time about Doctor Who and about 2/3 of the time about all sorts of other things too. And we do it about 3 times a week for about, half an hour to an hour each time, basically.
Yeah, I think multi-week podcasts. Part of me thinks that's crazy, but part of me is the part that, well, I I have like 3 different podcasts on my own,
Yeah.
on 3 different feeds about 3 different topics, so it's not that far removed. And also and also I'm a fan of like the movies by minutes, which they'll do 3 to 5 episodes a week. And I've done 3 episodes a week whenever I did my Fight Club minute as well. So it's not that far out of the ordinary.
Well, and the thing is as well, if you said, right, we'll put out 1 episode a week, but you've got all these things you want to talk about, you'd never get around to them, would you?
No.
So you have to, but if you want to talk about more things than just, if you've got a 1-track sort of mind that wants to do just Doctor Who, once a week, that's fair enough. But if you want to talk about other things as well, you have to slot those things in.
Mm-hmm.
You can't sort of make them wait their turn because you just never get around to them.
And as always, I'm Bubbawheat, and you can find me on all social media where I'm at Bubbawheat, and you can keep up with me and all the various podcast projects that I'm doing. And if you want to keep up with this show specifically, we also have a Facebook group. It's Time to Rewind, a time loop group. And you can join that to discuss episodes as they come out or have any discussions about time loop movies, TV episodes. It's all welcome there. And until next time, smoke me a kipper and I'll regenerate before breakfast next week.